We're now at a time where playing home console games on the go is a reality. The Switch has made gamers' lives more dynamic. They don't have to choose which games they're going to play on the go or at home. They just play the same game. This not only streamlines playing games, it also saves money. They don't have to budget for portable gaming and home console gaming. They are one and the same. There have been a few valiant efforts to bring this exact thing to life, but nothing has come close to executing what Nintendo has done with the Switch. So how did we get here? Nintendo's venture into portable gaming started with Gunpei Yokoi, an engineer at Nintendo. He observed a man playing with a calculator during his commute, probably the same way I would play mine during school. This inspired him to create a watch, or desk clock, that doubles as a self-contained gaming machine. Nintendo named it the Game & Watch. The technology behind the Game & Watch is also very simple, much like a basic calculator. Game & Watch systems use reflective LCD screens. The character's actions are animated by parts of the LCD displaying a single frame of motion that turns on and off. This gives off the look of movement. The Game & Watch didn't just give us a fun way to pass the time on the go, it also revolutionized gaming. With the release of the Donkey Kong Game & Watch, it featured a brand new way to control the character. It used the very first D-pad, also invented by Gunpei Yokoi. The D-pad has been a staple in almost every Nintendo gaming machine ever since. A variation of it is also used by Nintendo's competitors. As fun as the Game & Watch is, you can only play a single game so many times before you need to branch out. In 1989, Nintendo made available what would become one of the most iconic systems they would ever make. They released the Game Boy. It ran off 4 AA batteries and sported an unlit green screen. The key feature of this portable was the introduction of the game slot that used interchangeable game cartridges. In contrast to the Game & Watch, which is what the Game Boy was replacing, that played a single game per system. This completely changed the way Nintendo handled their portable gaming business. No longer were control layouts custom tailored to specific games. Instead, a universal control scheme was designed. That meant games now had to consider these controls when they were being developed. You would think that this would be a giant hindrance. However, it was the contrary. Games thrived with the minimal controls available. They took note from their home console market, which had introduced this idea almost 4 years earlier. Instead of making a new system for every game, they could sell a single console and continually sell games for it. The iconic green and yellow screen was totally different than the Game & Watch screens. Not only does it have a contrast dial, but it doesn't only display still images that turn on and off to portray movement. These sprites actually move and look great doing it. Sure, the blur that happens when something moves on the screen is pretty bad, but we didn't know that back then. Playing a full Mario game on the go, now that was a way to pass the time. The Game Boy has many great titles: Super Mario Land 1 and 2, Metroid 2, and Link's Awakening, to name a few. But the Game Boy didn't just offer first-party games, it also had games that were made by other game developers. The Game Boy really helped broaden the spectrum of gameplay that was available. As mentioned earlier, the screen is not lit, which would become common for Nintendo handhelds. This meant that you could only play this in optimal light. Most Game Boy owners would use third-party lights that would help them play in the dark. Though not optimal, they got the job done. A few years into the lifetime of the Game Boy, Nintendo decided to crank up the intensity and released a Game Boy model in different colors. They called it the Play It Loud series of consoles. This added a splash of color on the console shell, but kept the system the same otherwise. In 1996, Nintendo released a revised version of the Game Boy called the Game Boy Pocket. This was a console revision, not a brand new console itself. It only plays original Game Boy games. The console was considerably smaller and thinner, hence the Pocket name. This was a big change as it was no longer a giant brick. It also ran on 2 AAA batteries, which was a massive upgrade over the 4 AA's the original Game Boy used. The biggest change came with a new screen. Out were the green and yellow colors. It still has a slight green tint, but it's much closer to black and white. This was a preferred color change for many Game Boy owners. It also minimized the blur that occurred when movement was on the screen, which was also a big upgrade over the original. Although it's also not lit, meaning it still needs optimal external lighting to be played. The Game Boy Pocket played the same games as its predecessor, meaning you didn't need this console to play the newest games. You could still play new releases on the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Pocket added desired revisions to the original Game Boy design. Though it wasn't a huge leap forward, it was absolutely an upgrade from its predecessor. 1998 brought a much bigger change to the Game Boy family. This Game Boy had similar dimensions to the Game Boy Pocket, but added a few new curves. It's also a very comfortable console to play. It uses AA batteries, but only 2, which is very reasonable considering what this console brings to the table. It's the first Nintendo handheld that plays games in, you guessed it, color. This doesn't seem like a very big deal today, but it was a significant feature added to a handheld console. Considering that every other Nintendo handheld had only displayed monochromatic colors, this was a giant game changer. The Game Boy Color is often referred to as being a console revision, as in, it isn't considered a brand new console generation, kind of like a half step up from the current console. Though I've always had trouble believing that. Why? Because there's a whole library of games that are only playable on the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy logo was also changed on the sides of the boxes, and they used newly designed cartridges that were only compatible with the Game Boy Color. If that's not a new console, I'm not sure what to think. To me, it's the next generation for Nintendo handhelds. The Game Boy Color was truly a great console. It not only plays Game Boy Color games, it's also backwards compatible with original Game Boy games. This is huge. You don't have to use your old Game Boy to play your original games. You could carry around one console and bring all your Game Boy games with you. But it also added a feature that was really innovative and turned those old games into something new. It would display those old games in color. Basic colors, but color nonetheless. They also gave you the option to change the color palettes by pressing the D-pad in various directions, or a combination of D-pad directional presses with A or B. This was absolutely astonishing at the time. It breathed new life into those old games. If you didn't like the color options, you could display the games in true black and white. This handheld gave consumers all the flexibility in the world. If you like color, great. If you don't like color, great. Do you still like your old games? Perfect. It's a perfect Game Boy in every sense of the word, except for one glaring issue: the screen. It also isn't lit. Again, you have to rely on outside sources for light. If you think about it, it's a massive hindrance for a handheld. You can only play it when light is available. If it weren't for this humongous omission, I think the Game Boy Color would have gone down as one of the greatest handhelds of all time. Now it's considered a slightly better version of the Game Boy Pocket. Nothing more, nothing less. The successor to the Game Boy Color was so technically superior, they gave it a name to reflect that superiority. They decided to call it the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo really changed things up with this portable. Instead of being an 8-bit handheld, this is a 32-bit console. That's 4 times the bits. That's the same amount of bits the PlayStation had. I'm not sure what bits are or what they do, but the one thing the console wars taught me, the more bits it has, the better it is. The games on this thing look amazing. Many have described the GBA as a portable Super Nintendo, and it has some of the best SNES games for it. The biggest change came with the form factor. It's now in landscape mode. Gone were the days of portrait mode. For now, anyway. It's ultra comfortable. Having the buttons on either side of the screen felt like a step forward. The form factor of the games also changed to be much shorter, which looked more modern and took up less space. The screen displays significantly more colors than the Game Boy Color, which is apparent immediately. The level of detail jumped drastically with this handheld, but it also featured the backwards compatibility the Game Boy Color had. It can play all Game Boy titles. It also retains the color palettes from the Game Boy Color. This was very important for people who still like to play their favorite Game Boy games. You can play all of them on the GBA. The Game Boy Advance is a perfect portable system. The form factor is comfortable and compact, but there's one problem with it, and I'm sure you've already guessed what it is. Nintendo still didn't make the screen lit. It released in 2001. Sega had a backlit screen on the Game Gear 11 years earlier. This screen is also surprisingly dark. Having to again rely on outside light sources is a spirit killer. The box is so deceiving. It really looked as if it were backlit. If you want my thoughts on this console, I've made a video about it. I put a link in the description. Nintendo knew that this non-lit handheld needed a revision, which is why they made that revision 2 years later. The Game Boy Advance SP is a Game Boy Advance with a massive upgrade, one that would finally give people with Game Boy games something to rejoice over. The screen is lit. Just front lit, but that's okay. It still had a screen that could light itself. This was and still is huge. You could finally play Game Boy Advance games with a lit screen, which also meant that you could finally play original Game Boy games with a lit screen. Though you could have played them on a Super Game Boy, but I covered that in a different video. Nintendo didn't stop revising with the screen only. They also changed the form factor. It went back to the old portrait style mode, which cramped up the console controls, but they did this to add one of the most innovative console designs that they would ever come up with. It could now fold up, literally taking up half the space it originally occupied. This design protected the screens and buttons from unnecessary wear. They also added a rechargeable battery, which revolutionized the Game Boy maybe even more than the lit screen. You didn't need to pack around a bag of batteries, but that also meant that you couldn't just replace them if the Game Boy died. Although the battery lasted at least 7 hours, which is phenomenal compared to what we have now. The headphone jack was also removed to save space. If you wanted to use headphones, you needed to buy an adapter that plugs into the charging port. Not an ideal solution, but at least we could still use headphones with it. After a year of the GBA SP being on the shelf, Nintendo launched what they called a third pillar to their gaming consoles. They named it the DS. It took the design of the GBA SP and improved upon it. We're going to get into this in another video, so I won't say much, but it is worth mentioning because the DS and DS Lite both play Game Boy Advance games. They both have Game Boy Advance slots on the bottom of the consoles that only play Game Boy Advance games. In 2005, Nintendo released an updated version of the Game Boy Advance SP known today as the AGS 101. It has all the great features of the SP, but they upgraded the most important aspect of the system. The screen was now properly backlit. Finally, a Game Boy with a backlit screen. Replaying all the great games with this display is perfection. It took until 2005 to finally get it right, but they hit the mark with this edition. And this Game Boy is backwards compatible, meaning you can still get that glorious image for all your Game Boy games. The AGS 101 is the definitive Game Boy. Also in 2005, Nintendo released a tiny Game Boy console called the Game Boy Micro. This little Game Boy is really a Game Boy Advance because it only plays Game Boy Advance games. It's not compatible with Game Boy Color or original Game Boy games. This console is very small. It's perfect if you want to carry a game system wherever you go. It's the most modern and sleek Game Boy ever produced. The Game Boy Micro has a premium feel and look, and it also has a headphone jack. If this has a headphone jack, I'm sure they could have included one on the Game Boy Advance SP. It features a tiny screen that is actually quite good. Another feature of the system is the removable faceplates. You could swap them out and create a custom-looking system. This would be the final console to carry the Game Boy name. An odd end to a legendary line of portable systems, but fitting that it's a premium console. Nintendo's Game Boy line of portable systems ran from 1989 to 2010 in North America. Most were the preferred portable systems during their respective runs. They provided quality gaming that proved to stand the test of time. But these times were changing. 3D graphics had been a staple in the home console market, rarely making an appearance on Nintendo's portable consoles. But that was about to change. A third pillar would become a major supporting beam. With a touch and inspiration from the past, this was the future, and the future was now. After a year of the Game Boy Advance SP being on the shelf, Nintendo launched what they called a third pillar to their gaming consoles. They named it the DS. It took the design of the GBA SP and improved upon it. The clamshell design was present, along with the rechargeable battery. It also included a dedicated standalone headphone jack and a sleep mode. This new handheld also innovated with a throwback. Design elements were taken from the first Nintendo portables. These elements were revised and innovated to accommodate the modern world. 2 screens were added, one on each half of the console. One of them is a touchscreen, which was revolutionary for the time. The stylus was also added into the console so screen presses could be deliberate and precise. A GBA slot was also included on the bottom of the system that allowed only Game Boy Advance games to be played on it. But that did make it backwards compatible, which helped it appeal to Game Boy owners. Nintendo explained that it would be a complementary console next to the Game Boy Advance and GameCube. But we knew what they were doing. This was the next phase for their handhelds. It made no sense keeping both the DS and the Game Boy Advance when this played both libraries of games. This essentially made the Game Boy Advance part of the DS. People really only needed to buy the DS to play all the current games. Unfortunately, this meant that the long-standing tradition of having the current handheld system backwards compatible with all Game Boy games was now over, which really was a loss for people who like to play them. The console design is chunky with many angles. It more resembles a toy rather than a sophisticated piece of technology. But that didn't matter. The tech this portable had was so advanced, it made the Game Boy Advance look like a relic of the past. Nintendo knew that they needed to blow us away with their DS games. What better game to demonstrate how great this new system was than by making the legendary Mario 64 a launch title for it? This was amazing. 3D games on a portable system was astonishing. Nintendo really likes to design and improve their successful consoles. The DS was mega successful, so it got 4 revisions. The first DS console that was treated to a revision is called the DS Lite. This design improved pretty much everything about the original DS without compromising anything about it. The DS Lite is a sleek, compact handheld as opposed to the chunky, angle-ridden original. The buttons feel much better, as if they have more travel, which felt more like a home console controller. It also retained the Game Boy Advance slot on the bottom, which is kept safe with a nice cap. But the biggest improvement that they made to this console were the 2 screens. They made them backlit. They look very similar to the GBA SP101 screen. The colors look so vivid, and the image looks so much sharper. Not only that, but they also implemented 4 levels of brightness. This was great for playing in direct sunlight and also playing in the dark. Additionally, you could ration the battery life by turning down the screen's brightness. This console revision was one of the very best ever done by anyone. You could tell that everything was meticulously crafted and designed to be the most optimal it could be for the time. However, there is one thing that hinders the DS Lite. It's not a big issue. In fact, it's not an issue at all, because you can still play it just fine. When you play Game Boy Advance games, the game cartridge sticks out at the bottom, which again isn't really a problem, just an eyesore. It almost looks as ridiculous as the Game Boy Advance SP does when original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are played on it. Everything else on the DS Lite sits flush with the console shell, including the triggers, switches, and stylus. But I'm okay with the compromise. The DS Lite is a vast improvement over its predecessor. The third iteration of the DS came almost 3 years later. This model was given the name DSi. It's roughly the same size as the DS Lite and has similar screens, which are slightly bigger. However, it did change up quite a bit from the previous model. It now features 2 cameras, one inward and one outward facing. The DSi added connectivity to the internet that allowed for downloads from the DSi shop. It was also compatible with certain games that were only playable on the DSi. You could also use SD cards to expand the system's storage, which was a great addition. However, there's one glaring omission on the console that really takes a step back. They removed the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot, which was a giant negative for the console. This updated model only plays DS games. This was a big deal for many people, but Nintendo wasn't finished tinkering with the DS just yet. The fourth and final version of the DS came out just a year after the release of the DSi. This new version was bigger, and that's really the only difference between it and the DSi. They cleverly named it the DSi XL. Fitting for what it is. The bigger screens and longer battery life were some of the few draws that enticed people to buy it. Many claim that this is the definitive DS experience, saying the larger screens and more room to grip the console made it a more comfortable console to play. The next phase of Nintendo handheld systems wouldn't stray too far from the previous generation, even keeping the DS name, but added the number 3 to the beginning of it. It retained the clamshell design that worked so well for the Game Boy Advance SP and the DS family of systems. That design became synonymous with Nintendo. It added the circle pad, which functions surprisingly well as an analog stick. The top screen was also changed to a widescreen. It could also connect to the internet and download apps and games. It included a virtual console that allowed users to download classic games from Nintendo and Sega, including the Game Boy Color, Sega Game Gear, and the NES. Early adopters were given 10 Game Boy Advance games and 10 NES games through their Ambassador program. The NES games were eventually available on the Virtual Console for individual purchase, while the GBA games were never available to anyone outside the Ambassador program. But the biggest and most prominent addition was the stereoscopic glasses-free 3D. This was such an amazing feat. Keep in mind that this came out during the 3D craze of the early 2010s. All the movies at the time were being made in 3D, and 3D TVs were selling at all the major retailers, although those TVs required special glasses to experience the 3D. This new system didn't require glasses and really did display 3D. It really is quite amazing. The 3DS wasn't initially received very well. It required that you keep your head still in a very specific spot. If your head wavered out of that specific spot, the image turns into 2, blurring the gameplay and making it difficult to play. If you didn't like the 3D effect, Nintendo added a slider that decreased the amount of 3D that is displayed. The slider also turns the 3D off altogether. This original model is sleek and modern. It has a premium feel that wouldn't return on future models. It's also backwards compatible with DS games. Nintendo took a look at the DSi XL and decided to implement the same design into the 3DS. They increased the size of the console and screens. They also redesigned a few of the buttons that made them feel a little bit better. The console was also redesigned so that the bottom screen didn't leave marks on the top screen after being closed. However, the screens remained the same, but bigger. The 3D effect still suffered from the small area your head had to be in to experience the 3D properly. This was a major setback for people. The one thing that needed to be fixed remained the same. Though this model did improve the form factor and button placement, it looked and felt less premium than the original model. With 2 models on the market, it was surprising Nintendo put out another one. This new model was marketed as a more kid-friendly version. It omitted the clamshell design and went with a solid form factor, calling back to the original Game Boy Advance, which was the last Nintendo portable to feature a non-closable design. The shape is much more round than other models. It has a wedge design as well. It also omitted the 3D effect. This console was aptly named the 2DS. Initially, it wasn't well received, but some have gone on to call it the best 3DS model. But this wasn't the end for the 3DS's legacy. It would go on to be further revised and crafted. In 2015, 2 new models were released. The new consoles were given the name New, which spiraled the 3DS console names into confusion. The new 3DS and new 3DS XL perfected the 3DS console. The biggest improvement came with the 3D effect. Both systems have face tracking that keeps the 3D in focus. This is what the 3DS should have been when it initially released. This was the vision. The 3D is excellent and much more tolerable compared to the earlier models. Other things were redesigned, like the start and select buttons, 2 more shoulder buttons, the C-stick, and a faster processor. Super Nintendo games were also added to the Virtual Console, but they were only playable on the new systems. The smaller model also featured swappable faceplates, letting owners customize their consoles however they'd like. final model of the 3DS would come with a redesigned 2DS. In 2017, Nintendo released the new 2DS XL. This model features all the upgrades the new 3DS and new 3DS XL have, but without the 3D. This is a 2DS, only playing games in 2D. The shell was also redesigned with a matte finish and a top screen that looks more like a smartphone. The game slot is now on the bottom and the stylus is also significantly shorter. This would be the final model in the 3DS family of systems. The DS line of handhelds revolutionized portable gaming, introducing touch features and real 3D effects. This third pillar would become a major supporting beam for Nintendo. In early 2016, the next step for Nintendo handhelds would be released, but it was also a home console. Nintendo successfully merged both their handheld and home console markets into one device. The Switch brought everybody together under one roof. It was an ambitious idea, but it was pulled off successfully. Nintendo wanted you to play the Switch wherever you were, even if you were with somebody. The included Joy-Cons double as separate controllers once detached from the main unit. Though not ideal, it's a great idea. The Joy-Cons work best when they are used together. In fact, you can use them in multiple playstyles. You can play games with them attached to the screen, detached separately, or hooked to the Joy-Con grip, which acts like an actual controller, though the preferred controller is the official Pro controller. There are also other controllers made for it that make the gameplay experience the best it can be. There must have been massive amounts of thought put into this console. It's so unique versus what has ever been made. But the main reason to own a Switch is to have your home console games on the go. It's great having the ability to seamlessly go from playing a game on the TV, then to take the same game and console on the go, and play it as a handheld. This has been one of Nintendo's finest moments. To meld their home and portable markets so perfectly has been magical to witness. But this isn't the end of the Switch's story. In mid-2019, Nintendo announced that a new Switch model would be coming out. A few months later, the Switch Lite was released. This new Switch model is smaller, lighter, less expensive, and is a handheld only. It no longer has the ability to play games on a TV, but that's just fine. The Switch Lite is a fantastic handheld, has a great feel and changed up a few things that optimize gaming on the go. The Joy-Cons no longer detach, which makes sense for a handheld. It also has a D-pad on the left Joy-Con that feels great. Now playing games that were designed with the D-pad in mind can be enjoyed without having to use other options. It's all built into the console. Most Switch games are compatible with the Switch Lite, which is great for people who are on a budget or enjoy handheld gaming only. Nintendo has sold the Switch and Switch Lite alongside the 3DS line of handhelds. Just like the Game Boy Advance SP when the DS was released, we all knew that one was going to overtake the other. The Switch undoubtedly superseded the 3DS, and has now become the primary focus for Nintendo's home and handheld markets. We are now at a time where playing home console games on the go is a reality. The Switch has made gamers' lives more dynamic. They don't have to choose which games they're going to play on the go or at home. They just play the same game. Nintendo has a long history with their handheld gaming consoles. From the calculator-inspired Game & Watch, to the massive leaps made with the Game Boy systems, to the revolutionary gaming styles of the DS and 3DS, all the way to the current Switch, Nintendo has provided and is continuing to provide quality portable gaming. The future is still up in the air as to what is to come next. Whatever it is, their history tells that it'll be perfect for playing on the go.